this part, I'm going to talk to you about learning from class lectures and video lectures. Now, there are some clear benefits to video lectures as opposed to class lectures, such as you can fast forward the video, you can rewind the video, you can speed it up, you can slow it down. But even with these benefits, they still tend to have very similar structures to each other. They're still both lectures. So you're probably still going to learn from them in very similar ways. So given that, I think it's fair to group them together. And with that, I shall move on to some of the points that I have here. So the first one I want to mention, that is, there tend to be two groups of people, right? There tend to be the listeners and the note takers. Now, the how I would define those two is I would say a listener is someone who doesn't learn very well when they're taking notes all throughout the whole class. And then the note taker is the one who's actually learning better through taking notes. So now I wouldn't say that it's really a binary thing where you're either one or the other. It's more of a continuum. I would say that I'm somewhere in the middle, leaning towards a listener. So keep that in mind, that you don't necessarily fall completely into one category or completely into the other. You might be somewhere in the middle. Now, maybe you're more of a listener. Let's start there. So, if you are more of a listener, make sure that you read the book before going to class. Now, I think that this is true regardless of whether or not you're a listener, that you probably should read before going to class. But if you're a listener, it's almost essential. Right? So especially if you don't take any notes at all. Even a listener, I think they should take some notes, but if you don't take any notes at all during class, you definitely should read beforehand, because that gives you a bit of extra background knowledge. So even if you're not taking notes, you're still following the conversation. You still have some background knowledge to work off of. Again, this is really true of both groups, but it's especially true of listeners, it seems. Now, let's say you're more of a note taker. So, again, true of both groups. You really want to keep your notes neat. If they're too messy, the notes are sort of pointless when you're studying later. So keep your notes as clean as possible, but try not to spend so much time keeping them neat that you lose track of what's going on in the classroom. A few things that I've seen before, it's very neat to separate different topics, give yourself some space between them, maybe one or two lines that are just completely blank, so that way you know where one thing ends and another thing begins. I've also seen some students write in different colored pencils or pens. Like maybe red means an important formula or equation. Maybe green means like an explanation. Maybe blue means an example problem. So things like that tend to make your notes more palatable later on when you're reading them. Now, another thing, try not to focus so much on writing that you don't listen. Now, again, this is true for both groups. It's especially true for the listeners, but I put it with the note takers because the more notes you take, the less you listen. So if you're very good at multitasking and you can listen to the professor while checking out the professor's slides, while taking notes, and it all still makes sense, that's a very good thing. But make sure that while you're taking those notes, it still makes sense what you're writing down, right? And it still comes from what the professor is saying. So make sure to incorporate the professor into your notes. This next part, um, there's a very good rule of thumb I've heard before that if the professor writes it down on the whiteboard, it's probably good to write it down as well. Again, this is true for both groups. I really don't think that even if you're a listener, you shouldn't be taking any notes during class. But even if your notes are a bit more bare bones than the note taker, I would still recommend if the professor thinks something is worthy of emphasizing to the point of writing it on the whiteboard, it's probably a good idea for you to put it in your notes. It will depend on the student and what sort of teacher the professor is. Maybe they write everything on the whiteboard. They don't have slides, so they just use the whiteboard. In that case, up to you really, but as a general rule of thumb for the average professor, if they emphasize something on the whiteboard, you should probably write it in your notes as well. Now the next point I want to make is, let's say you just finished up with class and you have a bit of free time, maybe like a half hour or an hour before your next class. This is the perfect time to stop and check the notes that you wrote, make sure they all make sense, fill in blanks, things like that, because everything's still fresh in your mind. And it's almost like you are retaking that class session over again. So checking your notes after a classroom does that double purpose of making your notes more readable in the future and also making you relive the whole classroom experience. Now this is the last point I have, and I left it last for a very good reason, and that is because people are very scared of asking questions in a classroom. And I just want to encourage you to ask questions now while you're still allowed to make mistakes. Now what I mean by that is once you get out of college, maybe you go into the workforce, maybe you go into a bigger university or something like that. The higher up you get, the less mistakes you're expected to make, the more you're supposed to understand. So right now, while you're in a room full of a bunch of people who don't understand, is the perfect time to ask questions. And for most professors, that's actually a very nice thing for them. Many professors actually really like that sort of stuff because what they don't like in a student isn't a curious student. They like curious students. What they don't like is the student who sits around like this, sort of zoning out, ignoring them, and then when the test comes around, they get a bad grade. Because they don't want to be there, and that's not a fun student to teach. So asking questions is actually a positive for many professors because it seems like you're interested and engaged and you actually want to know what you're learning. So I would encourage you to ask questions. Even if you're afraid at first, it gets much easier the longer you do it. And that's the majority of what there is to say about learning in classes. There are lots of nuances depending on the person that's learning, so just keep that in mind when you try and integrate what I've said into your personal classroom learning experience.